So we're ready to begin, and thanks to all participants and panelists for joining this virtual panel on Fair AI for Europe.
It's very good that we are here because I think it's indeed a very extremely topic that we need to discuss regularly, because this is, I think, we often tend to forget that this very nice technology touches upon fundamental rights, touches upon human rights. And from my perspective, being a member of the European Parliament, I think that the problem, especially when we speak about facial recognition and other kinds of technologies, that is the problem with biases. Because who decides about the data? Who are the people? What technologies are being used to make sure that these technologies really facilitate us equally in society?
One of the things I worry about is that people think that AI is a special thing and they forget that there's programmers behind it. And because there's programmers behind it, you can absolutely deliberately go in and insert your biases because you're worried about who gets to vote for you and who doesn't. And so you put more people of one type into jail, right? So so now going back to how is AI exceptional? I think the one thing that's most exceptional about AI is that people over-identify with it.
We're going to move on now to Ekaterini Eliakopoulou. Katerina, you've worked with EDF in California on clean technologies. You've advised startups, and you're currently in Brussels with the European Institute of Innovation and Technology, which is part of the EU's push for competitiveness. And I think you're particularly interested in the entrepreneurial side of that. And now you're working on a new AI certification project, sort of on the side, aimed at small and medium-sized enterprises. Tell us a little bit more.
Thank you, James. Yes, so before jumping in the project itself, I would like to put a bit of context and explain why we started digging on the question of AI bias together with Kevin, which is a dear friend, still sitting in California, actually. We are coming from the startup world, both me and Kevin, and we know very well that startups, small companies, really don't have the time to be preoccupied with AI, ethics, biases, all these elements. They're really struggling day after day to break even and to survive. So I was very happy to see that the European Union is currently enrolling a strategy about AI, and this is very, very nice. However, when I first read the white paper to take a sneak peek, a quick look, something was a bit off for me. And I chatted about it with Kevin, and he validated my initial impression. And let me explain very briefly. So the white paper makes two big categories, the high risk and the low risk applications. High risk applications have, of course, healthcare, energy and transportation sector. And it makes perfect sense because, of course, I would never want someone from my close environment to be misdiagnosed by an AI marginal error. Of course, makes sense. And they put very tough requirements there. However, all the rest of our lives are falling in the low risk category. I'm an engineer, so I looked for statistics to see, do a reality check. And I found that 50% of our online time is spent on social media, and the other 50% on the gaming sector, shopping, entertaining. Okay, but let's step back. How can these low-risk applications be low risk if we're pretty much so much exposed to them? Would it be the case that one low-risk applications multiplied by thousands of times can become high risk? An example. Let's say I read one time one fake news. I don't believe it at first. It doesn't influence the way that I see the world. But if I read it thousands of times, it starts getting on me, influencing me. It could be, we could say that it could even affect my mental health after some time. So suddenly it jumps in the high risk applications. So what I want to say here is that there's so little attention for the things that the average citizen is mostly preoccupied. Luckily enough, there is this tiny section in the white paper just before wrapping up and concluding that leaves the room open for initiatives for certification labeling schemes for these low-risk applications. So here we are with Kevin, and this is the reason we wanted to be here today, because we jumped on the project, we took the challenge, and we started developing a volunteering certification scheme, which is a not-for-profit open source initiative. And we would like to be able to offer this certification to startups and small companies that they would like to be tested for fairness in their algorithms. And it's very early days, and we're very happy to discuss with you, because we will be looking for feedback and support in this initiative. And Kevin will brief us right after, I think later, the discussion on how we intend to approach it.
Kevin, like Joanna and Katerina on this panel, you're an engineer. You have degrees in statistics and AI from École Polytechnique and from Harvard. And you sort of fell for the lure of Silicon Valley early in your career. When you, I think, were out there, you worked with a big health insurance startup, Oscar, which, if you just Google it, is huge. It is the first unicorn company in that sector. And now you're on the founding team of another startup called Moss.com, which is helping students get grants and debt-free funding for their studies. Question for you, does Silicon Valley care about what we're talking about here today?
Mm-hmm. Thanks, James. Well, I've worked at 4 startups of different sizes, from 4 people to 1,000 people. And I must say, I've never seen any resources specifically allocated to tackling biases. I think there's multiple reasons for that. One first big one would be just lack of time. The life of the startup is super hectic, and you're always juggling so many projects and deadlines that you need to very aggressively prioritize your time and the type of initiative that you work on. And another reason that I found was sometimes startups also don't think that it's their direct responsibility to be tackling issues of bias. So one example is the first company I worked in was operating in online advertising, where we were facilitating the use of personal data for online targeting, which I think under the white papers framework would be on the low risk application side. And the way we were positioning ourselves was to position ourselves as the Switzerland of online advertising. We're saying we are just a platform, we're on the infrastructure to move data, so we shouldn't be the ones taking sides on how the data is used, and we shouldn't be the ones accountable and responsible for how the data is used, which was not preventing customer from potentially using the infrastructure for discriminatory practices potentially. So I think there's this low visibility and awareness internally at startups that can be an issue, and that doesn't mean obviously that the issues of tackling biases are not present. And startups have a very big role in technology design and technology innovation. Even if they're down the line acquired by big tech companies, the decisions that you make very early on when you're building a product at a startup can have a very lasting influence on the impact that product will have on society, because the decisions set the product and the tech around it on a trajectory in terms of design, implementation, and how it's going to be scaled up that can be very hard to revert down the line. So on that side, I don't know what the EU has specifically in mind on how to tackle these low-risk AI applications from startups, but I think there's a big gap there because startups have no time for self-compliance.
No, that is fascinating about how at the very earliest stages in the very, very frenetic atmosphere of developers and people trying to build up unicorn companies, some of the things that we're talking about today they aren't really priorities, and they're the ones building this stuff. Now, if I could ask you, can I ask you before we'll go back to Katerina a bit later in the webinar, but can I just ask you to tell us more, a little bit more about the proposal that you're working on with her?
Right, yeah, definitely. So what we have in mind and where we want to help is to provide tools for smaller players, SMEs and startups, to make their AI fair and ethical, and do that in a way that they can also showcase to investors and to customers as a token of trust, and also as a potential differentiators when compared to their competitors. Because today in Silicon Valley, ethical tech is quite of a cool buzzword, but there's still a big lack of trust in tech companies just overall. And it's also hard to, even if you care about this issue, it's hard to show that you're making efforts in the right direction. And if we take the case of the EU, even if you were a startup today and you wanted to self-comply, self-certify, it'd actually be a very hard process, because in the first place, you would need to digest the white paper from the EU and even understand what it means for you to be an AI ethical company. So what we want to do is to make that process of first understanding what it means to build fair AI, and then to actually get certified for it as frictionless as possible. And for what we have in mind.
So our approach would be to test the AI model's outcomes through APIs. And that would be constituted of three core components. First, the actual access to a model through an API. Second, and fair AI taxonomy. And third, the ability to run statistical tests to actually perform that audit on the model. And so on the first part, an API is basically a seamless way to communicate with an AI model, which would allow our audit system to look at the outcomes and vet for potential biases or discriminations. And now, looking at the outcomes in this way through APIs is an alternative that is way more frictionless than trying to open up all of the company's systems and then check all of the processes one by one. And on top of that, it allows us to focus on the outcomes of the models and not on the processes, which is really what you want to do. You really want to focus on the outcomes, because even if all of the processes of the company are well designed, if down the line the outcomes are not fair and contain discriminatory practices, then you haven't solved the real issue. Once we have this API access, the second piece would be to create a fair AI taxonomy, which would translate the 7 requirements of fair AI as defined by the EU in their latest white paper on AI from the end of last year, and translate those requirements into statistical requirements on critical variables such as gender, ethnicity, or religion. And once we have this taxonomy, then we will be able to run statistical tests and be able to audit and assess whether bias is present. So on that statistical test and how it would actually run in practice, here looking at an example and at the case of renter applicants. If we want to evaluate whether a model that approves or rejects applicants for a new apartment is biased across gender, then what we would do is look at a big cohort of male applicants with different characteristics for each, like their salary, their history of rent payment, and their current location where they live right now. And then what we would do is take these male applicants and transform them into female applicants with the same other characteristics or very, very similar ones. And doing so, what we can do then is to statistically assess whether this change of gender, the switch from male to female, by itself led to substantial changes in the outcomes. And it's also possible to visualize that. And here in the graph, you can see that in this theoretical example, if you're female, you actually need a substantially higher salary to be able to get the same renter score, which means the same likelihood to be approved as a male applicant. That would be very similar otherwise. That might look like an example that's kind of too blatant to be true, but there was actually an issue with Apple credit cards at the end of last year, which was very, very similar. So a real world case where couples were applying for credit increases, and those couples, in those couples, the man and the woman were having very, very similar financials, but for some reason, the men were approved and the women were not approved for very obscure reason that were not there. So that example is actually not far-fetched at all. And at this point, we are launching as our initiative as a nonprofit, and we're looking for SMEs and startup partners to help us design and test our APIs. And at the same time, on the substance of the certification, we're really looking to partner with policy experts, policymakers, and also academics on helping us define what fair AI exactly means, both conceptually and statistically, and help us narrow down the parameters that we need to test to certify fair AI for all.
Let me just go back to Katerina quickly on that.
Yep.
One thing that Kevin was talking about is that, actually maybe there's a window of opportunity right now, because big tech is not exactly flavor of the month. It's not seen as the most ethical player in the room these days. And you're sort of exploiting that opportunity to perhaps push AI developers I mean, there's demand for the ethical branding.
Definitely. Yeah, so right now, big tech, so the Google and the Facebooks of the world are setting up business units to define the specs, what is ethical, what not, fine. But for me and Kevin, we don't consider big tech true competitors to what we do. And the reason is trust. And I will explain what I mean. So there are two layers to my eyes: trust on the internal processes that they are using, but also on the external outreach. On the internal processes, for-profit companies will always have revenues maximization as their number one goal. So even if they set up business units to define what's ethical and what's not, it can be compromisable if it hinders the revenue side of things. So this is about their internal question of trust. On the external, let's assume that they build up something for startups in order to certify them for ethical processes. I believe that they will struggle a lot on their outreach to small companies, because there are big scandals that have happened already, like Cambridge Analytica. And so a startup, if I was a startup, I would immediately go, well, fix your own house first. Like, how are you even entitled to certify me? So there's a big trust issue. And there's also an underlying, more intuitive caveat for them as well, which is pretty bold from a business perspective. Let's assume that I'm a small company and I build an AI product. Then Google, in a sense, would be my competitor. Would I turn to my competitor to get certified? No, it's just like a business conflict, if you want. So because of these elements, I think that these companies will struggle a lot on this space of ethical certifications, ethical outreach. That's why deep in my heart, I don't really consider them competitors of such initiatives.
Very, very interesting. I mean, you point out there that the people who might be most likely called on to develop some of the ideas around certification, around vetting AI, may be the ones that have the biggest conflict of interest, if I heard you correctly. Are there others who would want to jump in here now and perhaps respond to that? Because we don't want to be overly harsh to big tech if we are being, but maybe that's a really valid point.
I'll say quickly, since I unmiked already, but then pass this out. I think it's a mistake for exactly the reason that Katie said earlier about, like, oh, the world is not just high risk and low risk. It's not just big tech and everything else. So Palantir, can endanger a lot of people. Cloudflare can make a lot of decisions that we might say, are quite moral, right? We can look at good guys and bad guys throughout the space. One thing that's really essential, so Microsoft, mostly in the cybersecurity space, not so much to AI, but they do have literally transparency centers. And not every government has stepped up to bring people that are good enough to go in. So those resources are being underutilized, some of them, whereas other governments are utilizing them. So we do need to make the decision to have the regulators to go in and check this. But anyway, the ones that have names on them, yes, you're going to find out that they do care about their brand. And there's one thing I just really wanted to say quickly. I'm really sick of this myth that all people care about is the money that the money to their investors. It isn't like just, especially not in an instant, right? You care about the stability of your society, you care about your reputation, you care about the well-being of your employees And even if that's only because you're caring about the duration of how long you're making money, right? There's different strategies, like make a lot of money this year or make a lot of money for 40 years, right? So there are a lot of other considerations, and a lot of the companies are playing different games, longer and shorter term games. But power is something they care about too. Clearly, Twitter, you know, they haven't gone for huge amounts of money. They went for power for a long time, and Google did that for a decade before they started making money. So
further, but what I see now is that we, especially as legislators and politicians, we lag behind. So we need to start creating this framework first, in which legislation is there to protect fundamental rights. That's the first priority, I would say.
Does the self-certification for SMEs, at least, does that sit well with you, Joanna?
that's what I'm saying. It's a totally useful thing, but it's got to slot into also, it's not either or. Like I think it was Sarah already said that. It's not either or. It's about how do you create sufficient transparency so that the external regulatory pressures can be efficient, so you can show you've done the right thing, you can be kind of let alone and those parts, but still that proper regulation can be done centrally too. And that includes on really important things like convincing corporations to pay their share of the infrastructure.
This is really a question a little bit for, again, Katerina and Kevin. How much has the European Commission, and I would broaden this out myself and say regulators in general, how much openness have they got when it comes to taking on board third-party ideas on how certification should look like? You know, do we know if any existing certification schemes are inspiring them at the moment?
I would say that we don't know of any initiative that's, you know, off the ground and has gained support from the EU institutions at this point. That's also why we felt the urge to start on that and to try to come up with a proposal. We know that in the EU white paper, there's actually a call for action for voluntary certifications, and they seem, at least from the white paper, to be open to that idea, which we think is good to be able to accelerate that whole discussion. So we're hopeful, is what I would say, but we don't know for sure yet. And that's why we're trying, you know, to start participating in those discussions, getting more visibility, and be able to confirm and get feedback on our proposal.